At any given time in America, there is a dominant story about how the economy is performing and treating those of us who live and work in it. And it is only against this story that the key lessons of the current crisis can be understood. The dominant story for most of the past generation begins in the late 1970s, when prices were soaring, key industries were sinking, and society generally seemed at a dead end. Our nation's leaders, others before and with him, but most memorably Ronald Reagan, reacted by stomping on the economic brakes, deregulating industries, reeling in safety nets, and generally remaking the economy in a much more free market mold. This free market makeover took. Inflation declined, growth revived, and by the late 1990s, Americans were enjoying a sustained and broadly shared prosperity. But from the very outset, there were hints that something else, something distinctly less pleasant than prosperity was going on. Americans in growing numbers, and not just poor or blue-collar Americans, but affluent white-collar ones as well, were telling pollsters they were increasingly uneasy about their economic circumstances. Now, for most of the last generations, our efforts to explain this unease and to find its real underlying causes, and I want to emphasize that I think that we are looking not for feelings, but for objective conditions, were singularly unsuccessful. We spent years, for example, intently focused on jobs and whether bad jobs were outrunning good jobs. And then the economy started churning out hundreds of thousands of new jobs a month, many of them high-paying and high-tech, and we had to shelve that explanation. We spent an equal amount of time on income inequality. And while inequality may be important for all sorts of reasons, I don't think it explains much about economic insecurity, at least not among the majority of Americans who have shown themselves to be amazingly tolerant of it just so long as they get their piece of the action. These failures led many analysts to conclude that when Americans had things to say about insecurity, they simply didn't know what they were talking about. They basically misread their own economic situation. But reports of insecurity have continued to grow, and the economy has delivered a series of sharp blows, of which the current crisis is only the most dramatic, to the notion that all it was producing was prosperity. Where I think we went wrong in our earlier efforts to understand insecurity's causes was in looking at the wrong place, for example, solely at workers at the workplace, and for the wrong development, good jobs gone bad. The right place to look is where most people get their economic sense of themselves, and that is in their families, American families up and down the income spectrum. The right answer about what's causing economic insecurity, I submit, is that the rewards of increased prosperity have come at a large, but until recently largely unnoticed cost. In Highwire, which the Rockefeller Foundation has kindly given you copies of, I make three kinds of cases that families are running greater risk than a generation ago. I make a quantitative case by stealing a page from the stock market, where the standard measure of risk is the beta of a stock and tells how volatile a stock is by looking at how much its price swings around a broad mean. I develop a similar beta for family income. My headline finding, if you will, is that the income volatility of families in the economic middle of the pile has roughly doubled over the last generation. But the most striking finding is that the increase in income volatility has been remarkably democratic. It's affecting working poor families with little education in spades, but by now it is reaching into the ranks of those with college educations and family incomes running into the several hundred thousands of dollars. I make a structural case by examining the economic struts that hold up working families and that have held them up for generations, and by showing that virtually every one of these struts, jobs, yes, but also benefits, housing, health coverage, education, investment, retirement, even such bought and paid for safety nets as your homeowner's policy have been weakened over the last generation. And I make a narrative case by telling the stories of families of various means and across the country as they've experienced the economic changes of the last 3 decades. Let me just take a couple struts and a couple people. Benefits. When people talk about benefits, they usually talk about public benefits, Social Security, Medicare. But the benefits, the safety nets that really count for the vast majority of working-age Americans are their employer-provided benefits, the health coverage, the disability insurance, the employer-orchestrated 401ks. Most Americans are not aware of this, but their grasp on these benefits, their right to receive them, and their remedy if they do not, is governed by a single federal law, ERISA. ERISA was intended by its congressional authors to protect employee benefits. We know this because it says so in the preamble. But over the past generation, the Supreme Court and increasingly conservative federal appeals courts have rendered a series of decisions that have turned ERISA on its head, making it easier for employers, benefit administrators, and insurers to deny you your benefits or limit them. Or take retirement, which is a story you all know. Nowhere is the shift, in this case from business to families, more complete than in the move from traditional pensions to 401k and similar accounts. With traditional pensions, the burden for managing and delivering the promised amounts to finance old age rests with employers. With 401ks, the burdens rest squarely with you. Now, theoretically, you could handle this task, but the fact is that a large fraction of Americans, perhaps a third of those who are eligible for 401ks, make such a hash of managing their money that they're not going to have enough to retire comfortably on. The idea that increased reward of any sort would come in match set with rising risk is uncontroversial in economic and financial circles, where all of life is seen as essentially a series of risk-reward trade-offs. Neither was the idea foreign to the late 70s, early 80s theorists of America's free market makeover. Where the current crisis strikes the dominant story is at this last step, that the great trade-off of the era of more risk for more reward was a good deal for working Americans. It leaves none of the arguments in favor of that trade-off undamaged, and I would argue leaves some of them in complete tatters. Just consider getting the incentives right. Appealing as it might be to want to see a borrower of a no-doc, no-down mortgage that goes bad suffer, the spillover effects are so fantastic that it can't possibly be that we've gotten the incentives aligned right. Consider the resulting foreclosure on a house, not from the point of view of the party to this ridiculous contract, but from its next-door neighbor, or the person in the same subdivision, or essentially homeowners across the country. Second point, business and government can't or don't want to provide safety nets, the safety nets they did in the past. Perhaps not, but we have seen some pretty spectacular rollouts, not real-ups, of safety nets in the current crisis. When the history of this era is written, I suspect that the Federal Reserve's decision to slip a safety net under essentially the entire financial system of the country, and not just the banks, will loom very large. I wonder whether creating safety nets on the fly like this is really any way to run a society. Finally, on the question of working Americans having reached some new plateau that leaves them able to shoulder their new burdens, I think the current housing, credit, and economic crisis is eloquent. Families are not, after all, like every other economic unit. Households are not hedge funds. The current crisis is teaching us that in the language of finance, we are still so long labor, income, and houses, there is no way we can possibly diversify our way out from under the new risk we have been assigned. The dominant theory of the past generation may have made sense at its inception, but the story, and most certainly the case that the risk shifts that it has involved over the past generations are a good thing, is now deeply flawed. Change will not come easily, certainly not with Washington finances in the dismal shape they're now in, but come, I suspect it will, and when it does, it will restore a set of values and protections that lie at the heart of what most of us mean when we say America.